Story 1. The Hollow Host. Let me start by saying I never believed in ghosts. I'm Matt, and I've always been a skeptic. Growing up, I'd laugh at my friends who swore they saw shadows moving in the dark, and I never bought into the whole paranormal craze. I guess that's why Jason asked me to join his show in the first place. Jason Lee, the guy behind Spectral Encounters, a ghost hunting show with a decent following, was obsessed with finding real evidence of the paranormal. He'd built his brand on dramatic reenactments, eerie music, and the occasional creak of a floorboard in a dusty old house. To me, it was all just entertainment, a way to sell ads and keep viewers hooked. But for Jason, it was more than that. He truly believed something was out there. I joined the crew as a cameraman a couple of years ago. It was a fun gig, traveling around to haunted locations, meeting locals with wild stories, and filming hours of nothing while Jason tried to make contact with spirits that never showed up. Honestly, I thought it was all harmless fun, until we went to Lover's Hollow. Lover's Hollow, a small forgotten village nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, was supposed to be our next big hit. The place had been abandoned for decades, and the locals claimed it was cursed. Some said a series of brutal murders had taken place there in the late 1800s. Others spoke of a woman who vanished on her wedding night, her spirit forever wandering the hollow in search of her lost love. It was all the usual stuff, but Jason was convinced this place would give us the footage we needed to go viral. We arrived at the hollow late in the afternoon. The air was thick with that eerie stillness you only get in places no one goes anymore. The village was mostly in ruins, collapsed cabins, overgrown paths, and a crumbling church that still stood at the center of it all. Jason was buzzing with excitement. "Matt, this is it," he said, his eyes wide with anticipation. "I can feel it. Tonight's the night we get something real on camera." I shrugged, setting up my gear while the rest of the crew, Tessa, our sound tech, and Derek, our second cameraman, scoped out the area. Tessa was a believer, always talking about energy and vibrations. Derek, like me, was just here for the paycheck. As the sun set, we started filming our intro shots. Jason gave his usual spiel, talking about the tragic history of Lover's Hollow and how we were there to uncover the truth. The whole time I kept feeling this strange heaviness in the air, like the atmosphere itself was pressing down on us. I chalked it up to the isolation, the kind of unease you get when you're deep in the woods with no cell signal and only the sound of your own breathing to keep you company. By the time we were ready to start the investigation, the sky had turned a deep purple, and the first stars were just starting to peek through the clouds. We split up into teams. Jason and Tessa headed to the church, while Derek and I took the old inn at the edge of the village. The inn was in worse shape than most of the other buildings. The roof had partially caved in, and the floors were warped from years of neglect. As we made our way inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I know, cliché, right? But there was something about that place. Something off. Every step we took echoed through the empty halls like someone, or something, was walking right behind us. Derek set up the static cameras in the main room while I scouted upstairs. The second floor was even worse than the first. Narrow hallways, doors hanging off their hinges, and this thick layer of dust that seemed to muffle every sound. I found an old bedroom and decided it was as good a spot as any to film. That's when I heard it. A soft humming, like someone was singing just beneath their breath. At first I thought it was Tessa, but she and Jason were still over at the church. I called out to Derek, but there was no answer. The humming grew louder, more insistent, and I felt this cold rush of air sweep through the room, even though the windows were boarded up. I backed out of the bedroom, my heart pounding. I'd filmed enough haunted places to know this wasn't normal. There was no logical explanation for what I was hearing. I made my way downstairs, and that's when I saw Derek. He was standing perfectly still in the center of the room, his camera on the ground at his feet. His eyes were wide, unblinking, fixed on something just outside the window. "Derek," I whispered, stepping closer. "What are you looking at?" He didn't respond. His mouth opened slightly like he was trying to speak, but no words came out. That's when I looked outside and saw it. Something moving in the shadows just beyond the tree line. It wasn't human. It moved too fast, too fluidly, darting between the trees like a flicker of light. I couldn't make out its shape, but I could feel it. This intense, malevolent energy radiating from the woods. Suddenly, Derek snapped out of it, gasping like he'd just come up for air. He looked at me, eyes wide with terror. "We need to go," he muttered. grabbing his camera. "Now!" I didn't argue. We rushed outside, but the moment we stepped through the door, everything went dark. The sky, which had been clear just minutes before, was now covered in thick, swirling clouds. The village felt different, like it had shifted somehow. The church bell rang once, echoing through the hollow, even though the tower was half collapsed. Jason and Tessa came running toward us, their faces pale. "Did you hear that?" Jason asked, breathless. I nodded. "We need to leave. Something's not right." But Jason, being Jason, wasn't ready to give up. "This is it, Matt. This is what we came for. We're staying until we get something on camera." I wanted to argue, but the look on his face stopped me. He was so convinced, so sure that this was the moment he'd been waiting for. We regrouped at the church, but the air had changed. It was colder, thicker, like we were breathing in fog. Jason set up his equipment near the altar while Tessa lit candles, her hands shaking. I tried to film, but the static in my headphones made it impossible to focus. And then we heard it. The humming. This time it was louder, closer. The candles flickered, and the temperature dropped so suddenly that my breath came out in visible puffs. The door to the church creaked open, and the figure we'd seen outside stepped inside. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a person either. It was something else, something ancient, its form constantly shifting, like it was made of shadows and smoke. It glided toward Jason, who stood frozen in place, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and terror. The figure stopped inches from him, its voice like 1,000 whispers speaking in unison. "You are not welcome here." Before any of us could react, the candles went out, plunging the church into complete darkness. I heard Jason scream, and then nothing. Just silence. When the lights flickered back on, Jason was gone. We searched the entire village, but we never found him. Tessa was sobbing, Derek wouldn't speak, and I couldn't shake the feeling that Jason had gotten what he wanted. He'd found something real, something beyond what any of us could comprehend. But whatever it was, it had taken him. We left Lover's Hollow that night. And even though it's been over 3 years since Jason left us, the memories of that night still haunt me, often keeping me up all night.
Story 2, The Prey. I still can't believe any of this happened. It feels like a bad dream, a nightmare that I can't wake up from. I've thought about it every day since I returned, and no matter how many times I tell myself it wasn't real, that I must have imagined things, something deep inside me knows the truth. I wasn't alone out there. Something was hunting me. It all started on what was supposed to be an ordinary hiking trip. My name's Megan, and I've always loved hiking. Nature has always been my escape, a way to clear my mind and reset when life gets too hectic. This time I decided to take a solo hike through the Appalachian Trail. I'd done it with friends before, but this time, I wanted to be alone. I thought it would give me some peace, some clarity. I drove up to a small town called Beckley, West Virginia. Quaint place, tucked into the mountains, with a population of maybe a few thousand. I stayed in a cheap motel the night before and planned to set off early the next morning. The trailhead was just outside of town, so I had breakfast, checked my gear, and headed out. It was a perfect day. Not a cloud in the sky, cool breeze, and the trees were just starting to turn that golden autumn color. I remember feeling so at peace that morning. My phone buzzed a couple of times with texts from my sister Katie, asking if I was sure I wanted to go alone, but I brushed it off. I liked the solitude. At least I did at first. About 6 miles into the trail, I saw something strange, out of place. A man. He was walking ahead of me, alone, but something about him felt off. He wasn't dressed like a hiker. His clothes were too clean, too urban. Jeans, a plain black t-shirt, and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. It was as if he had just wandered off the street and onto the trail. I don't know why, but a chill went down my spine when I saw him. Maybe it was the way he moved. Slow, deliberate, like he knew something I didn't. I decided to hang back and keep my distance. I mean, it's a public trail and he wasn't doing anything wrong, but there was something in my gut telling me to stay away. I slowed my pace and eventually stopped altogether to give him time to get ahead. I sat down by a small creek, drank some water, and waited. About 20 minutes passed, and I figured it was safe to continue. But when I rounded the bend, he was there, standing on the side of the trail, just looking at me. His face was still mostly hidden by the cap, but I could feel his eyes on me, and my heart started racing. Without a word, he turned and walked into the woods, disappearing into the dense trees. I don't know why, but I felt this overwhelming sense of dread. The logical part of me said he was just another hiker, maybe a local who knew the area better than I did, but something else told me I was being watched. I picked up my pace, hoping to shake the feeling. The trail grew narrower as I climbed, and the trees seemed to close in, casting long shadows even though it was still early afternoon. That's when I heard it, a branch snapping behind me. I turned, expecting to see a deer or some other animal, but there was nothing. Just the sound of the wind rustling the leaves. I pressed on, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. Every so often, I'd hear a rustle or a footstep just behind me, but whenever I looked, there was no one there. My heart was pounding, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. About an hour later, I came across a small abandoned cabin, just a simple, run-down structure, half covered in ivy, with a sagging roof and boarded-up windows. It looked like it had been there for decades, maybe longer. I didn't want to go near it, but I needed to take a break, and it was the only spot where I could sit down. The air felt colder around the cabin, like the trees were holding their breath. As I sat there, catching my breath, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. A shadow, just inside the tree line, darting between the trees. It was too quick to be human, but it was too large to be an animal. I jumped up, suddenly feeling like I wasn't alone again. My first instinct was to run, but I forced myself to stay calm. And then, I heard it. The voice. A low, raspy whisper coming from the trees. It was so faint that I couldn't make out the words, but I knew it was calling my name. Megan. Megan. I froze. No one knew I was out here except for Katie, and she was miles away. There was no way anyone should know my name. I turned, ready to bolt, but the path behind me had changed. The trail was gone, replaced by dense underbrush and trees that hadn't been there before. I was trapped, surrounded by woods that seemed to twist and shift with every step I took. I started running, but the faster I went, the more disoriented I became. The forest felt alive, like it was closing in on me, pushing me towards something. I could still hear the whispering, growing louder, more insistent. And then, through the trees, I saw him, the man from before, standing in the shadows, watching me. I ran as fast as I could, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in pain. I didn't care where I was going, as long as it was away from him. But no matter how far I ran, the trees wouldn't let me leave. It was like the forest itself was alive, and it wanted me to stay. Eventually, I stumbled onto an old dirt road, my legs giving out beneath me. I collapsed, gasping for air, my mind racing. I was safe, or at least I thought I was, but something still felt off. And then, in the distance, I saw headlights approaching. Relief washed over me as an old pickup truck pulled up. The driver, a grizzled old man with a long beard and tired eyes, asked if I needed a ride back to town. I didn't think twice. I just wanted to get out of there. But as we drove down that dirt road, the man didn't say a word. His eyes never left the road, his hands gripping the wheel like he was concentrating on something I couldn't see. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it again. Just outside the window, running alongside the truck, was the shadow. I turned to the driver, but his face was different now. His eyes were dark, sunken, and his mouth twisted into a knowing smile. "You were never meant to leave," he said. That's when the truck veered off the road, and everything went black. I woke up in the same place where I'd first seen the man, lying in the dirt, as if no time had passed at all. The trail looked exactly the same, the trees unchanged. I got up, trembling, and walked back to my car without looking back. But even now, weeks later, I can still feel it. The forest watching, waiting for me to return.
Story 3. The Arena of Ashes. If you'd asked me a year ago if I believed in the supernatural, I would have laughed in your face. Ghosts, curses, ancient rituals, those were things people made up to scare each other around campfires. I was a rational guy, a realist. At least that's what I told myself. But after what happened last fall, I'm not so sure anymore. My name's Drew, and what I'm about to tell you isn't something I like to talk about. It's something I wish I could forget. It started like any other weekend. My buddies and I, Tyler, Danny, and me, decided to take a camping trip in the Appalachian Mountains. Tyler was always talking about how he needed a break from work, and Danny just liked to get away from the city whenever he could. I wasn't really into the whole outdoors thing, but it sounded like a good way to blow off steam. No phones, no distractions, just the three of us and the wilderness. What could go wrong with that? We packed up our gear and headed out early on a Friday morning, planning to camp near an old trail a few miles off the main road. Tyler had heard about the spot from some guy at work who said it was peaceful and untouched by tourists. That's what we wanted, complete isolation. After a long drive and a short hike, we reached the spot. It was beautiful, no doubt about it. The trees stretched high into the sky, their leaves just starting to turn gold with the coming autumn. There was a small creek nearby, and the air smelled fresh and clean, like pine and damp earth. It was perfect. We set up camp, built a fire, and spent the evening laughing and telling dumb stories, the way we always did. Everything felt normal. But as the sun went down and the woods grew darker, something shifted. It was subtle at first, just a weird stillness in the air. The kind of silence that makes you realize just how far away you are from civilization. I didn't think much of it until we heard the first scream. It was distant, echoing through the trees, so faint that I almost thought I imagined it. I glanced at Tyler and Danny, and by the looks on their faces, I knew they heard it too. Probably just an animal, Tyler said, his voice sounding more unsure than confident. Cougar or something. Yeah, maybe, Danny muttered, but I could tell he didn't believe it either. We tried to shake it off, but the mood had changed. The fire didn't seem as comforting anymore, and the shadows around us felt darker, thicker somehow. None of us said it out loud, but we all felt it. Something was wrong. We decided to turn in early, figuring some rest would help clear our heads. I crawled into my tent, listening to the crackling of the fire outside and the soft rustle of the wind in the trees. But then, just as I was about to drift off, I heard it again. The scream. Closer this time, and there was something different about it. Something human. I shot out of my tent, heart pounding. Tyler and Danny were already outside, staring into the trees, flashlights sweeping the dark forest. "Did you hear that?" Danny asked, his voice shaky. Before I could answer, a figure emerged from the woods. At first, I thought it was another camper, a man stumbling toward us, his clothes tattered and covered in dirt. But as he got closer, I realized there was something wrong with him. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were wide with fear, darting around like he was being chased. "Help me," he gasped, collapsing at our feet. "Please, it's coming." "What the hell?" Tyler muttered, kneeling down beside the guy. "Who's coming? What happened?" The man tried to speak, but all that came out were broken whispers. His breathing was ragged, like he'd been running for miles. We tried to calm him down, but before we could get anything else out of him, his body went limp. He was gone. We stood there in stunned silence, trying to process what had just happened. Who was this guy? What was he running from? "Maybe we should go," Danny said, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, agreeing for once that leaving sounded like a good idea. But before we could even gather our things, we heard it, the sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps coming from the direction the man had come from. We spun around, our flashlights cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Nothing visible, at least. Just the feeling of being watched. "What the hell is that?" Tyler muttered, gripping his flashlight tighter. The footsteps grew louder, circling us, though we still couldn't see anything. And then, out of the shadows, came a voice. a deep, gravelly voice that sent chills down my spine. "Welcome to the arena." 2. The moment the voice spoke, the ground beneath us shifted. The trees seemed to pull away, the shadows lengthening and morphing until we found ourselves standing in a clearing that hadn't been there before. In the center of the clearing was a massive stone circle, like an ancient arena carved into the earth. And standing at its edge were figures, dozens of them, their faces hidden in the darkness, watching us in silence. "What the hell is this?" Danny whispered, backing up toward me. Before any of us could react, the figures began to move, slowly closing in on us. They were chanting something, low and rhythmic, but the words were in a language I didn't recognize. The air grew thick with smoke, and the ground beneath us turned to ash. The voice spoke again, echoing through the arena. "You will fight, or you will burn." Suddenly, the figures rushed toward us, their eyes glowing with a fiery intensity. Tyler screamed, swinging his flashlight at them, but it passed right through them like they were made of smoke. Danny grabbed my arm, pulling me back toward the edge of the arena, but there was nowhere to go. The figures surrounded us, their chanting growing louder, the ground beneath us glowing red like hot embers. And then, everything went black. When I woke up, I was alone. The arena, the figures, everything was gone. I was lying on the forest floor surrounded by trees. My head was spinning, my body aching like I'd been through a brutal fight. I called out for Tyler and Danny, but there was no response, no trace of them. It was like they'd vanished, swallowed up by the forest. I stumbled through the woods for hours trying to find my way back to the campsite, but it was like the trail had disappeared. The landscape had changed, twisted somehow. Eventually I found the road, but by then the sun was already rising. I reported them missing to the local authorities, and for months, nothing. No bodies, no gear, nothing. It was like they never existed. I couldn't stop thinking about it. The arena, the voice, the figures. It haunted me. And then, a few months later, I got a call from the sheriff's office. Tyler and Danny had been found, alive. They'd wandered into a small village about 50 miles from where we'd camped, barefoot and covered in mud. But here's the thing, they didn't remember me. They didn't remember the trip, the arena, anything. They didn't even remember their own names. I rushed to the hospital hoping to see them, to shake them out of whatever state they were in. But when I walked into the room, Tyler and Danny just stared at me like I was a stranger. Their eyes were vacant, hollow. They didn't recognize me. They didn't recognize anyone. It was like their memories had been wiped clean. The doctors said they were suffering from some kind of extreme trauma, but they couldn't explain what had caused it. They're undergoing treatment now, but nothing seems to be working. Every time I visit, I see them sitting there, staring off into space, like they're still trapped in that arena. Whatever happened to us that night, it took more than just their memories. It took them. I don't know what's real anymore, or if any of this makes sense. But I do know one thing. I'll never go back to those mountains.